For right now. Yeah. For now. I know, that's just it, it can change next week or next month.
Test.
Sorry, forgot to walk through that. Yep. We had a kitchen system, so we used that this week.
You know, I mean, on one hand, might make some people happy, on the other hand. Yeah. Well, you know, and that's, you know, it's all.
Your son.
Tired, long weekend.
You guys, I know you're not ready to do something.
Only a couple of times. Yeah, but No, but... All right, good morning. All right. Welcome to our third part of Daniel and Revelations. Today we're going to talk about 4 episodes in Daniel's life. And so this is going to be a bit of a turbo survey. We're going to hit 4 chapters all in one. So hold on. We're going to move fast. So to get started, we turn on our electronics. All right. So far, right, Gordon covered the court of Nebuchadnezzar, gave kind of that high-level overview. That was part 1. Part 2, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar's dream with the statue and the 4 parts. We did all of that last week. This week, as we mentioned, 4 episodes in Daniel's life, and you see that Gordon got away with like a chapter, a lesson. I get 4 chapters in 1 lesson. Cool.
I saved it for you, John.
It'll be fun. It'll be fun. And then next week, preview, I'll get to do 5 chapters in 1.
Good for you.
No, I'll do 6 chapters in 1. We'll go 7 through 12. So this is intended, again, to be kind of a turbo approach. So we're going to read pieces and parts, and we're going to talk through each of these pieces a little bit in a high level. I think it's fun to re-attack some of these stories that sometimes, we cover once, cover when we're little, and then don't come back. Of course, it's different for me. I covered all of them when I was older because that's what happens. So our first episode, you're going to need your Bibles. Roger's going to be good on the spot to move us there as well. But go ahead. Yeah, he's getting his fingers warmed up. Go ahead and open up to Daniel chapter 3 so that we're ready to go. I'm going to ask for folks to help read parts of this as we go. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. So if somebody would read Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. We'll have it up on the screen as well. Chapter 3, 1 through 7.
King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, yea, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, yea, and every kind of music, all peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set.
So I wanted to read that piece specifically because it ties back to our last lesson. How does this tie back to our last lesson? So we've got another statue, right? So the last lesson was all about the statue, right? And so now, and of course this isn't like immediately after receiving the vision, Nebuchadnezzar goes out and does this. We don't really have a link in time necessarily. But Nebuchadnezzar does go out and build this statue after, like, Daniel just said, hey, here it is. Now, what else about the statue is an interesting connection?
It's all gold. The other one with the head.
It's all gold, right? And then the other one, the head was gold. And who did the head of the previous statue represent? Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, really, right? And then the other kingdoms that come after it. So now we've got the whole statue. That's a lot of gold. That's a lot of gold, right? So a cubit was like 1.5 feet. So height was 60 cubits, 90 foot tall statue of gold, right? 6 cubits wide, so 9 foot wide. Yeah. Right? So here we are. We've been reading the book of Daniel. We just had Daniel tell him about the statue. And we know the rest of the story. I'm not going to go too far into the story, but of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do what they had been doing. They paid them no attention. The king throws them in the fire, heats the fire up, throws them in the fire, kills the people who threw them in. I don't want to go necessarily through all those things, but something weird kind of popped up to me, right? What's the title of this lesson? 4 episodes in Daniel's life. Where's Daniel? Where's Daniel?
He's in the library reading a book.
Right? Where's Daniel? Anybody got a bead on this? He's certainly not in this story at all, right?
Well, he is if he's the teller.
Well, okay, so the teller of the story, sure. But what else? Why? I guess let me kind of jump around a little bit. So, or keep rolling, and maybe we'll come back to this a little bit later. I went to the plains of Dura. That's about 20 miles out of Babylon, from the palace, give or take, as far as I was able to find. 20 miles ain't a trivial thing, right? So Nebuchadnezzar gathered everybody up and shipped them all out to the plains of Dura to do this. Probably left Daniel behind to keep things running, right? So this is so I kind of take that, Daniel's not there, right? But why would we do that this way? Why in the world would we have the book of Daniel talking about kind of Daniel and his interactions in Babylon, but then not have him as a part of this story? Why not chuck Daniel in there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Why is Daniel not there?
Well, Samuel isn't everything in the book of Samuel.
Yeah. It's not all about him, right?
It shows that there are other followers of God other than just Daniel that's in the king's courtship.
Right. These things that we read about aren't just affecting Daniel, right? So as Nebuchadnezzar makes these proclamations, and as we get to the other pieces, right, it helps to give a better sense of the impact throughout. And I think on the flip side shows, like you mentioned, that it's Daniel's not the only one here who's following God and doing his will, following his instructions.
The way it's written, you get the sense that Daniel is witnessing this, even though he's not mentioned. He is there to record what the command was, what the statue looked like, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
This one wasn't targeting anyone in particular, unlike the Lion's Den, where they were specific.
Well, we'll get there in a minute. Yeah, we'll get there in a minute. So this was intended to be a pretty broad application, and we'll talk about what they do with Daniel later. Sure. So I want you to take a second. We're going to do lots of imagining today. I want you to think back to when you kind of first, heard this story or learned this story as a kid, or for those of us that teach this class for our kids, what are the key takeaways that we, when we're younger, take away from this story, or we try and impress upon our kids? And more importantly, I'm kind of curious or the thing that occurs to me about this is, what is it about the things that we take from this story and impress upon our kids that we still apply today?
Obeying God.
Obeying God, yeah.
God will take care of you.
God will take care of you, absolutely.
The fear and respect for God. If you look at the context when it comes to Daniel, Judah's in activity, right? Because they disobeyed God, idolatry. You can see that previously.
Yeah.
When it was in Jeremiah, they were worshiping Baal, and they tried. And Jeremiah tried to save Judah, but unfortunately that didn't happen because Judah faced consequences, right? So then all of a sudden they're in captivity, not only under the Babylonians, but later under the Medo-Persians, I would say,
Right.
essentially. That being said, what we can do for today's lesson is that fear of God, and as she said previously, obey God, because it's not only a captivity on earth, but a captivity of eternal death.
Absolutely, and I love that perspective, right? When the Jewish people had their choice, what'd they do? They went off and worshipped a stick, right? Baal and Ashtaroth and all of that. They worshipped a stick and a rock. And now we've got kind of that juxtaposition. Now they're being forced to worship a hunk of metal, right? Pretty metal, right? And the active choice against it, right? They had all the opportunity to provide proper worship to their God when it was all just them. They didn't, and the consequence was pretty severe, right? And now they're put into the opposite, where they are forced to provide that worship, and if they don't, the consequence is severe. And yet, these three, and Daniel later, do it anyway. Awesome. Yeah.
Oh, you calling him?
Yeah.
Okay. So in verse 18, verse 17 says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, our God will take care of us. But then they said, but even if he doesn't, we will still not worship.
Yeah.
that idol.
Yeah.
Even if he doesn't save us.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting. So I wonder if we would be extracting the same lessons if they were thrown in the furnace and not saved. I think so,
Well,
but
we
that, I
might
mean, obviously
not-
that's not what
we might
happened,
not pick up on it,
right?
but we should. I mean, this lesson obviously shows God's power,
Yeah,
but it also shows the great faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say, even if he doesn't save us, we're still not going to do it.
right. Absolutely. And I'm going to turn. I'm going to mess up my slides a little bit. I think this is really important, right? And I think one of the important things for us is, did God set out and have a plan to preserve Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Yeah, sure, right? It happened according to how he intended. Why did he let them get thrown in the furnace? He didn't have to.
Proving a point of his power.
He's proving a point in his power, but I think that also, that's a strong application back to us, right? Sometimes you're going to wind up in the furnace, right? God plans to save you, and sometimes you're still going to wind up in the furnace. All right.
Going along with your question, why do you think he's not there? I don't think Daniel would have bowed down to this image.
I don't think Daniel would have either, right? He would have been.
Why isn't he among them? That's a question.
And I think one of the other pieces that I picked up that I really liked, and I apologize I didn't hit it earlier, I think it's for Nebuchadnezzar. Because look at what Daniel had done for Nebuchadnezzar so far. And what if Daniel is there and they chuck Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace? What is Nebuchadnezzar going to do? Is he going to worship?
Interpret his dream.
Is he going to worship God or is he going to worship Daniel? If you keep Daniel in all of these pieces, I think it puts the focus in the wrong spot. And I apologize, I didn't remember I was going to mention that earlier. So thank you, Werner, for bringing that up. So to cruise through, we need to get to the next one. What do we take from this? Of course, no matter the circumstances, God is God. We'll all get a chance to witness for Christ at some point. And God is always with you. And that second bullet rings to me because you don't know when it is, right? And before I was a Christian, I knew Erin, and I knew that she was a Christian, and certainly she was a huge influence on me, but it was some other guy. I don't even remember his name, okay? But I was a physics major, and we were up at the board doing physics problems, and we hit a bump, and I used the Lord's name in vain. I'm like, oh, this problem stinks. And he's like, dude, don't do that. You don't need to do that. Please don't say that. Right? Hit me like a 2x4. Right? It was important, and here I was doing something that was offensive. Not to take any of the away from Aaron, but it takes a lot of different things. And for me, that's a piece in my life that I will always come back to. He doesn't remember my name. I don't remember his name. But he had a chance, and he took it. Something simple as saying, could you please not do that? All right. We're going to move on to our next episode. So if you would please flip a chapter. I told you we're going to move fast. And we're going to read closer to the end of this one. Let's read Daniel chapter 4 towards the end. If somebody could read Daniel, before we read it, Nebuchadnezzar was at his palace and saw another vision in his head. Daniel came to interpret the vision, gave him a proper interpretation, and Nebuchadnezzar, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of kind of reaction to that, other than Daniel saying, listen up, that the vision was effectively, bad things are going to happen to you, listen up. And then in 28, if somebody could read 28 through 37.
All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, is not this great Babylon, which I built by my mighty power as royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, they fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass as an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills. One point.
Yeah, it's through 37.
37. Immediately the world was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven until his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the habits of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand, or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, for the glory of my kingdom. My majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors, my lord, sought me, and I was established in my kingdom. And still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, extol, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble.
Wow. So what do we know? All right, so King Nebuchadnezzar, he was, let's see, he was prolifically proud, right? And it's not just recorded here. It is certainly recorded here, right? Walking on the top of the palace and wow, look at all of my greatness. He is a little bit, and we have lots of evidence, right? Archaeologically, Nebuchadnezzar is everywhere. And when I mean everywhere, I literally mean everywhere. Like the streets. Each of the bricks on the streets, he had stamped with his name. We have thousands and thousands of bricks with Nebuchadnezzar and all of his titles stamped on them. So, in terms of kind of ancient reigns, Nebuchadnezzar's reign is fairly well documented. So, brings up an interesting point. Do we have any evidence of his madness? Do we have any evidence of his madness? There's a picture of one of the blocks that's in the British Museum. You can see that inscription in there, and it tells you a little bit about what's on it. It's his name and his titles.
After he's restored, that moment becomes Nebuchadnezzar's golden age of everything that is Babylon. And it only happened after he was restored. God bless him.
Right, and so from an evidence perspective, when you look back at kind of the archaeological records, you see a whole lot of things, well, I should start over on this side for left to right. You see a whole lot of things from kind of the start of his reign as he's building up Babylon and all this documentation about, and the great Nebuchadnezzar built this, 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 and then nothing. It goes away. And then you have more.
What is amazing is God kept his kingdom intact, him on the throne as eating like a donkey. A crazy guy, a weird looking guy. God has done that time and time again, but also God, when it comes appropriate for his purposes, takes a man like him off the throne.
Yeah, it is interesting because Nebuchadnezzar did stay in power through all of this. And certainly when we have the divided kingdoms, we've got some kings that do some great things, some kings that do that not so great things, but the Israelite, I mean, it was the Jewish people's, there was their king, so they ain't going anywhere. In this case, which is interesting, all of Israel is in captivity, and the king is gone, and they're still maintained, they're still cared for.
I would like to point out, before the 19th century, they thought that Nebuchadnezzar's existence was a joke at the time. Like, there was lack of archaeological evidence.
Right.
I think there was an archaeologist by the name of Paul who first discovered evidence of Nebuchadnezzar at the time. That's why, that was at the time, the secular movement was such at a high movement, because there was just substantial lack of evidence when it came to the Bible. And around that time too, I think there was another king too that was mentioned in Isaiah. His name was Sargon. He ruled in the Syrian Empire, I believe. I think it's been a long time since I've been invited, but he was discovered around that time too. And I state this only to say this, that no matter what, it's not within the physical proof. It's because it's in the Bible that we believe it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Let's see. I think we talked about some of these pieces already. We need to make sure we put credit where the credit is due, but I'm kind of curious, right? And we see this through Nebuchadnezzar, right? And it's kind of a classic case of learning something the hard way. And I just kind of reflect on that God sometimes helps people learn stuff the hard way. And because we're short on time, I just want to leave that with you. I think the really interesting thing to me this time around was the dream. And if I had it back, the dream would have been where I focused the verses. When you look at this dream, right, going back to like verse 10, the visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven. It was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, fruit abundant, and food for all. The beasts of the field found shade. Skipping a little bit, I'm paraphrasing for time. I saw in the visions as I lay in my bed, behold, a watcher, a holy one came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said this, chop down the tree and lop off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds fly from its branches. But leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. And on and on and on. Sometimes when we get through these dreams and these prophecies, you look at them and you go, what in the world did that mean? Right? It's hard to kind of figure out, right? You think back to like the 7 fat cows and the 7 famished cows, and you're like, maybe you could guess, but that's kind of hard. This one doesn't seem all that hard. Right? This one seems really clear. What did the wise men say about it? I don't know. That one seems pretty clear. Right? That was really interesting to me reading this one through. The wise men still took a pass. They weren't willing to tell the king the hard truth. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, they were saving themselves, right? Did Daniel give him the bad news? Absolutely. He said, "This is how it's gonna be," right? And it wasn't, we don't get, I think, all of the details, but he does end it pretty sharply, right? In verse 27. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, and there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity.
And this isn't an attempt to convert him to Judaism.
Mm-mm.
This is God causing him to acknowledge his power over all men.
It's a head check, right? Nebuchadnezzar's head, nor his nameplate, fit through a door. Too many letters, too big a head, right? It's a head check. Settle down. It's not all yours, right? And in the end, right, I think Nebuchadnezzar's revelation of faith here is real interesting.
And we're also introduced into a new element, a spiritual element, a head watcher, a holy one, and the decree that was made by the watchers
Yeah.
on what would take place.
There's a whole lot of fun stuff in there, and that you don't get that when you cram 4 stories in one lesson. Nebuchadnezzar's faith here is interesting. And so I just want to highlight a couple pieces from it. It acknowledges God as a God. It encourages worship to God. And personally, he worships God. Right? So those are a few things that Nebuchadnezzar does. And that's the end of our encounter with Nebuchadnezzar from a biblical perspective. Right? We move on. So, I think, because a lot of what comes before is corrections for Nebuchadnezzar, what I would assert from this, right, is that, so I won't assert it because it doesn't say anything, right? But if Nebuchadnezzar had continued to foil and poke the Israelites, I bet there would have been a sentence for it. I think it's interesting that there's nothing else in Daniel. They don't say anything else about Nebuchadnezzar. I'll let you draw your conclusions from that, because we got to move on. Fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar. Now we get to Belshazzar. Let's see. What are we going to talk about with Belshazzar? We're going to need two people. We're going to read the beginning and the end. If somebody would read, you know what, I'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 9, and I'll have somebody else take a look through the end in a minute. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. Ooh. And the king of his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. All right? So Daniel is sent, right? Short version. Queen says, "Oh, send for Daniel." Daniel comes in, and ultimately, right? This is Belshazzar not really learning from Nebuchadnezzar's mistakes when looking at working with these visions. If somebody would read 24 through 31, kind of towards the end.
Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed.
So, this is Daniel interpreting for Belshazzar what's going on for context. Yep, keep going. Sorry.
This is the writing that was inscribed. Many, many people parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Meaning, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
So, just real quickly, numbered, right? So Mene is kind of, sounds like the Aramaic for numbered, but minas were counted in units. So the minas were went along and you kind of one by one. Shekels were weighed. The money was weighed, not counted. So interesting that The tekel is kind of somewhere between shekel and the Aramaic word for weighted, and then fractions represented divisions. So that is a word, the perez, sounds like the Aramaic word for divided. So that's where we come through that. It's interesting, though, here, kind of reaching back to the evidence. This has been a sticky spot forever until the mid-1800s, right? Because Nebuchadnezzar was very well documented, and so was his successor, and it wasn't Belshazzar. It was Nabonidus, right? But Nabonidus isn't in here. Belshazzar is in here. It took a little while to figure it out, but in that
Nabonidus wanted to be Indiana Jones, so he was a relic hunter. So that's why Daniel would be the third ruler, because Nabonidus and Belshazzar co-ruled.
yeah. Well, that's what we found. There's evidence to support that, right? A couple of artifacts. One saying that Nabonidus would pray for Belshazzar, his eldest son, and his offspring. So we have historical record that was discovered much later or recently that actually had Belshazzar on it. And another one that says that Nabonidus left Babylon for a decade, treasure hunter, and entrusted the king to Belshazzar. It doesn't say Belshazzar, but his oldest was Belshazzar.
Other people's temples and sending the stuff, booty back to Babylon.
That's right. And Belshazzar was abusing all of that stuff for sure. Another interesting piece, this one has a date because we know the day that Babylon fell, and it was October 12th. Right? It's interesting that we're kind of getting to a point where you can start to ascribe, dates. Now, of course, that's the current look at the date. October didn't mean anything back then, and you could figure out what the Jewish date was.
Neither did 539.
That's right. They weren't counting down before they knew what 0 was, for sure. But I found it interesting that, as we're walking through Daniel, and we've got such strong documentation, archaeologically, extra-biblical documentation, how some of these things kind of align. So I think that's fun. A couple interesting things to take from this. When last time I was up here, we talked a lot about, or I guess one of the lessons that we did, we talked about, the verse that talks about the sins of the father being visited upon the sons, and well, what does that mean, and well, how does that apply? And I thought that was interesting because here we have it again, that Belshazzar really gets his own opportunity, right? And it's Belshazzar's actions directly that cause this issue, and not anything that reflects down from Nebuchadnezzar or anybody else. But the other interesting thing is that he just doesn't seem to learn, right? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar had a very public departure from sanity, right? That while we don't have direct records of, I am certain that his son would have mentioned, right? And would have been part of that family's lineage. Everybody knows the secrets about the family, right? You know all the crazy that's in your tree. But nonetheless, we have Belshazzar carrying on with the same kind of hubris that got Nebuchadnezzar chewing up cud.
Generally, any lost battles, they don't talk about.
That's right. That's right.
They always cover and plaster on walls and monuments the highest moments of their empire.
History is written by the victor. Yep. All right. So we are short on time. We will cover our fourth piece, which is, as we'd mentioned, Daniel in the lion's den. Chapter 6. Daniel is elevated in Darius's office as part of his officials over time, right? So he kind of gets to build his reputation back again. And I think we're going to skip reading through this, but we're going to read verses 4 through 9. We'll go ahead and do that. chapter 6, 4 through 9. Then the presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, as Werner was saying, very targeted. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." And short version, we want to establish a law that we know is going to get Daniel in trouble directly, right? Specifically and targeted to Daniel. And of course, the king made the command. Daniel did what it was that Daniel always did by worshiping the God, and that was breaking the
They
rule.
thought they had an irrevocable doctrine.
Yeah, well, there was all kind. I don't want to get into all the, because we got 5 minutes. You don't do Daniel and lion's den in 5 minutes unless you
Well,
do.
we had him in the furnace. I mean, in the lion's den.
One of the two. And then in verse 16, it's brought to the king, you made this thing, blah, blah, blah. The king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought in. Now, of course, we know Daniel is taken care of, and all of those guys get executed and da-da-da. I want you to close your eyes and envision Daniel being chucked into the lion's den. All right? Think about it. Picture Daniel. How old's Daniel? In your eyes, right?
He's at least 72.
Yeah, he's probably 90 years old. But I don't like when I think about Daniel in the lion's den, I'm thinking like getting the chair and he didn't have to do that, right? But I'm not thinking about my grandfather, right? Walking into the lion's den, right? I don't have that mental image, but that's the mental image, right? Daniel significantly advanced in his years, tossed in with the lions, right?
From the old empire of Babylon, the lion was a major symbol, and probably would continue to be a major symbol of power for Darius.
Yeah. We don't have time to get into all that. So we're just going to go right here. You ever been attacked directly and unfairly for whatever reason? You ever been there? How's that feel? Oh, okay, that's stupid. It feels miserable. What'd you do about it? Anybody got a short share? What'd you do when you were attacked unfairly and directly? What'd you do about it?
Prayed.
Prayed about it? All right. What else?
Picked up faith and went on.
Picked up faith and went on. I had less spiritual responses. I'd go after him. Right? I would do things. Right? I would explain other pieces away. Right? I think we have. I think about this in like a work context when I'm under attack unfairly. Right? When my team is under assault. Right? You got your facts wrong. This is not the way we're going to do this. Let's go have this out. I think Daniel's response here is amazing. What'd Daniel do? What'd Daniel do? How'd he fight? He didn't. He did nothing. It was unfair, and he knew it, and he continued about his business.
Daniel didn't do opposition research.
I think that's fascinating, and that's something that's my personal challenge for me. So with them, I'm sorry, Werner. Ultimately, their faith in God was vindicated. The Babylonians came to know the Israelites, right? And the faith of the Israelites was proven and strengthened through all of this captivity. There you have it. Next week, 4 visions of Daniel's prophecies. Holy moly, 6 chapters. Hold on. Thank you.